The Duke of Crestwood arrived at his own wedding 14 minutes late and spent the first 30 seconds at the altar looking at his bride the way a man looks at furniture he has ordered and is not entirely sure he wants. That was the first thing. The second was what he said. He leaned toward his groomsmen, not quietly, not with the discretion of a man who understood that a church full of witnesses was not the place for private opinion, and said, in a voice that carried without effort to the first 4 pews, "She's handsome enough, I suppose. My father's standards were always more generous than mine." The church went very still. Lady Isabel Crane had been standing at that altar for 11 minutes already. She was wearing a gown that had taken 6 weeks to make, standing beside a father who had given her his arm with quiet pride, in a church that held every significant name in London. She had heard every word. She did not flinch. She did not colour. She turned her head very slowly toward the Duke of Crestwood, and looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has just had something confirmed that she had hoped would not be. Then she turned to the priest. "Is there a man of genuine character in this congregation?" she said, in a voice as clear and unhurried as a woman ordering tea. "Next suitor, please." The church did not go still this time. The church erupted. To understand what happened that morning at St. George's, one must first understand the 2 men who made it possible. The late Duke of Crestwood and Lord Crane had been friends since the age of 19. Since the particular years of youth, when friendships are forged in shared difficulty, and the people who endure it together become permanent fixtures. They had come up side by side, struggled together in the lean years before titles and inheritance had arranged their lives into comfort, and they had loved each other with the uncomplicated loyalty of men who had been tested young and past. When each had a child, the Duke a son, Lord Crane a daughter, it seemed to both of them the most natural thing in the world to say, over a glass of port on a winter evening when both children were still in the nursery, "Let them marry one day. Let what we built between us outlast us." It was an agreement made with warmth and without ceremony, and by the time Dominic Ford was old enough to be told of it, it had been a settled matter for 20 years. Dominic had agreed with the easy confidence of a man consenting to something he expected to cost him nothing. He had been told Lady Isabel Crane was accomplished, well-regarded, and handsome. He had formed no further opinion, because forming opinions about things he had not yet directly encountered was not a habit he had developed. Dominic Ford had grown up in a house where his every preference was anticipated before he had to express it, where disagreement dissolved in his presence like sugar in warm water, and where the word no had been so rarely applied to him that he had, by 30, largely forgotten its shape. He was not a man anyone had ever held to account. His father had loved him too well and corrected him too little, and the old Duke had understood this. Privately, in the last years of his life, with the quiet grief of a man who sees the consequence of his tenderness and can no longer undo it. Lady Isabel Crane had also agreed to honour her father's vow, but she had agreed on her own terms, which she stated plainly on the morning the engagement was confirmed. "I will marry him, father," she said, in the sitting room of their Mayfair house, with her hands folded and her voice level. "I will honour your vow, and I will enter the marriage with good will. But I will not set down my dignity to do it, not for a duke, not for any man. Whatever he is, I will meet him as I am." Lord Crane looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who knows he has raised someone considerably more resolved than himself. "I would not have it any other way," he said. "What happened at St. George's had its roots in a habit so long established in Dominic that he had stopped noticing it entirely. The habit of speaking his mind in any company, at any volume, without pausing to consider what it cost the person receiving it. He had arrived late, without apology, because apology was a currency he had rarely been required to spend. He had looked at Isabel across the altar with the assessing glance of a man who considers everything given to him as something owed, and he had spoken. He had said it the way he said most things, directly, without lowering his voice, with the complete assumption that the room would receive it as he intended. He had not yet learned that rooms are not always arranged to accommodate him. The words landed in 4 pews of absolute silence. He saw, a moment too late, the stillness move through the congregation like a stone dropped in still water. He turned to look at his bride. Lady Isabel Crane was looking at him with an expression he had never encountered before. Not anger, not grief. Something more considered than either. The expression of a woman who has just received a piece of information she needed and has already decided what to do with it. Then she turned to the priest and said the words that London would be repeating for the next 6 months. Her father offered her his arm as she walked back down the aisle. His face was composed. His eyes were bright. He said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done. Dominic stood at the altar and watched her go and felt, for the first time in his life, the specific sensation of a room that had arranged itself entirely without him. He was furious before the carriage reached Crestwood House. Not the clean fury of a man who knows he has been wronged, but the hot, formless fury of a man who has been embarrassed in front of 500 witnesses and requires somewhere urgent to put it. He put it where spoiled men always put it, on the person who had caused the embarrassment. She had refused him in front of all of London. She had walked away from him with her chin at an angle he found, the more he considered it, unbearably composed. His friends came that evening, and were incautious enough to find the situation privately amusing. He dismissed them before midnight and spent the remaining hours constructing, in his mind, a thorough catalogue of her failures. She was proud. She was cold. She had broken a vow her father had made, and dressed the breaking of it in the language of principle. And London was celebrating her for it, which told you everything about London's current state of judgment. He instructed his secretary in the morning to ensure certain invitations the Crane family might have expected would not be forthcoming this season. He leaned on 2 connections to signal that the broken engagement reflected poorly on their name. He did these things quickly, in the manner of a man swatting at something that has stung him, and felt briefly better. Lord Crane, it emerged within the week, was entirely unbothered. The man had connections predating Dominic's father, and a reputation that did not require Dominic's endorsement to stand. The social machinery Dominic had set in motion produced very little effect. Lady Isabel, from what his secretary could determine, had attended 3 events in the fortnight since the wedding, and been received warmly at every one. She was not suffering, she was not diminished. She had refused a duke at the altar, and London had decided to admire her for it. This made him considerably more furious. The fury lasted 3 weeks. Then something happened that it could not survive. His name was Cyrus. He had been in service at Crestwood House since Dominic was 4 years old. He had outlived the old duke, managed 3 housekeepers, trained 12 footmen, and maintained through all of it the particular dignity of a man who understood that genuine service was not the same thing as submission. He had never, in 26 years, offered Dominic an unsolicited opinion. He came to the study on a Tuesday evening, not summoned, appearing in the doorway with the self-possession of a man who has decided something and intends to see it through. Dominic looked up and saw in the old man's face something that stopped the dismissal before it could form. Cyrus came in. He stood rather than sat, not from deference, but because this was not a sitting-down conversation, and they both seemed to understand that. Then he spoke for 5 minutes, in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who has organized his thoughts carefully and will not be rushed through them. He told Dominic that the late Duke, in the final year of his life, had come to him one evening after dinner and said something he had never said in 30 years of their acquaintance. He had said that he was afraid of what he had made his son, that he had given the boy everything and withheld the one thing that would have served him: the experience of being told no by someone who meant it. He had said he arranged the match with Lord Crane's daughter because she was exactly the kind of woman who would not rearrange herself around Dominic's deficiencies, and he had prayed, quietly and without much faith, that when the time came she would have the strength to hold her ground. She had held her ground, Cyrus said. At considerable personal cost, in front of 500 people, she had held her ground. And Dominic had spent the 3 weeks since attempting to punish her for it using connections he had never earned and a title he had only inherited. Cyrus did not raise his voice. He did not perform the speech. He delivered it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, not to wound, but because withholding it would be the greater cruelty. Then he said one final thing. Your father would not have recognized the man you have been these past 3 weeks, Your Grace. I am not certain he would have wished to. He left. Dominic sat in the study for a long time after the door had closed. The fire burned down. He did not rebuild it. He sat in the cooling room with a voice in his head he had never heard before. Not his father's warm, indulgent voice. The voice of a man who had loved his son carelessly, but a different voice. The voice of a man who had watched what his love had produced and had been quietly ashamed of it. Who had made one last arrangement and died, hoping it would be enough. Dominic thought about what he had said at the altar. He had said it the way he said everything. Without thought, without any consideration of the woman standing across from him who had come there in good faith, honoring a vow she had not made. He heard it now the way she must have heard it. He sat with the sound of it until it became something he could no longer redirect toward anger. And then he sat with it a little longer. He did not sleep that night. The change did not happen quickly. Real change rarely does, and Dominic had more to dismantle than most. Decades of habits built on the assumption that the world would continue absorbing whatever he chose to put into it. It began with small things. He stopped speaking before he thought. This sounds unremarkable until you understand that for a man like Dominic, it was the equivalent of learning to use the opposite hand. Every instinct working against him, every comfortable reflex requiring sudden examination. He said something to his secretary one morning in his old tone and caught, for the first time, the expression that crossed the man's face before he could smooth it. A particular tightening, the practiced expression of someone who has spent years learning not to react, and is still, after all those years, performing the not reacting. Dominic asked him, that same morning directly, whether he was treated well in his position. His secretary looked at him with the expression of a man who has been asked a question he had stopped expecting and does not immediately trust. You may answer honestly, Dominic said. I am asking because I mean to know. What followed lasted an hour and covered things Dominic had never considered across years of close daily proximity. He did not enjoy the conversation. He suspected that was the point. He went backward then, through the catalogue of people he had dismissed or diminished, or simply failed to see as fully present. A former steward let go on insufficient grounds, whose reference had been written with such terseness it had cost the man 2 subsequent positions. A young cousin publicly mocked for a stammer at a family dinner 4 years ago. A neighbouring family feuded with over a boundary dispute that had never warranted the years of coldness he had sustained. He addressed each one, not publicly, not in the manner of a man performing penance for an audience, because that would have been another version of the same self-absorption wearing different clothes. He did it quietly, a proper reference written for the former steward, late and insufficient as a gesture, but sent. A letter to his cousin that did not minimize what had been said. A dinner invitation to the neighbouring family that came with no reference to the history between them, which was itself a kind of apology. None of it was comfortable. He had not expected it to be. He was beginning to understand that comfort had been the problem all along. He came to the Crane house on a Wednesday morning in February, 4 months after the wedding. He had not announced himself. He had not sent a card ahead, not to catch anyone off guard, but because arriving with his title arranged in front of him like a shield was another version of the weapons he was trying to put down. He was shown to the morning room and waited. Lady Isabel kept him for 15 minutes, which he considered entirely reasonable and did not spend impatiently. When she came in, she was exactly as he remembered her, and nothing like the version he had been carrying in his head. She did not look at him with triumph. She did not look at him with the particular coldness of a woman who has rehearsed an encounter. She looked at him with the straightforward attention of a woman who has decided to hear someone out and will form her opinion when he has finished. He did not make a speech. He had considered one and discarded it, because a speech was a performance and he had performed enough. He told her, specifically and in order, what he had done wrong. Not the altar alone, The years of behavior that had made the altar moment inevitable, and the 3 weeks afterward. The social pressure he had applied to her family's name, the instructions to his secretary. He described what Cyrus had said to him, what he had since understood about his father and about himself, the conversations and letters and quiet repairs he had undertaken in the months between. He said, "I am not here to ask you to resume the engagement. I came because you stood at an altar and told the truth about me in front of 500 people. And I have spent 4 months beginning to understand how completely right you were. You deserved to hear that directly." Then he stopped and did not fill the silence. Isabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "How is Cyrus?" It was not the response he had prepared himself for. "He is well," Dominic said after a moment. "He runs the household with considerably more authority than I do." "He always did," she said. "My father spoke of him often. He said Cyrus was the best thing in that house." Dominic said quietly, "He may have been right." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Isabel's expression. Then she stood and held out her hand in the formal manner of someone closing a meeting. "I heard what you said," she told him. "I will think on it." He left. She did think on it. For 2 weeks she said nothing, and sought no one out, and arrived at no conclusions she was willing to act on prematurely. She asked her father, who had known the Crestwood household for 30 years, whether the man he had watched grow up was capable of what was being claimed. Her father was quiet before he answered. He said, "Dominic's father told me once that the boy had everything required to be a good man, that he simply hadn't been given sufficient reason to use it." Lord Crane paused. "I believe your reason was sufficient." She wrote to Cyrus directly, with her father's blessing, requesting a brief interview. He came to the Crane house on a Thursday afternoon and answered her questions with the same quiet precision he had brought to the Duke's study 4 months prior. He did not advocate for Dominic. He described what he had observed since their conversation and left her to draw her own conclusions. What she drew was this: the change had not begun when Dominic decided to come to her. It had begun months before she had any indication he intended to approach her at all. A man performing transformation for an audience begins the performance when the audience is in sight. Dominic had begun, by Cyrus's account, in the days immediately following their conversation in the study. Alone, unseen, with no guarantee it would ever reach her, he had not changed to win her back. He had changed because a man who had known him since childhood had held up a mirror, and he had been unable to look away from what he saw. She sent a note that afternoon. It said only, "Thursday, 4 o'clock, if you care to call." He came at 3:45. He waited in the carriage at the end of the street until 4. She learned this afterward from the Crane household's footman who had noticed. She thought about it often in the years that followed. The Duke of Crestwood sitting in a cold carriage for 15 minutes so as not to appear too eager, learning, in his own deliberate way, what consideration actually looked like. They spoke for 2 hours that Thursday, and the Thursday following, and the one after that. She did not make it easy. She was not built for easy, and had no interest in performing it. She challenged him directly and without softness on the things he said that still carried residue of his old habits. The assumptions that crept into sentences when he wasn't watching. The instinct toward authority that surfaced in moments he hadn't anticipated. He received each challenge without deflecting. Sometimes he sat with one in silence for a full minute before responding. She found, over those Thursdays, that the silence was the most honest thing about him. He had learned that the first response was not always the right one. For a man like Dominic, that was not a minor lesson. It showed. They married in April in a church that held 60 people. Her family was there. 3 friends whose loyalty had proved itself in the months of uncertainty. Cyrus sat in the 3rd pew at Isabel's personal insistence, which caused some brief confusion among the guests, and no confusion at all between the people who mattered. The vows were ones they had written together over a long afternoon in the Crane library, which had produced 2 discarded drafts, and 1 argument that resolved itself honestly and left the air between them cleaner than before. There was no clause about obedience. There was nothing in the vows that one person issued to the other as a condition. They were the vows of two people who had decided to be responsible for something together, which was a different thing entirely from one person being responsible to the other. When Dominic spoke, he spoke quietly enough that the front rows leaned in slightly to hear. This was new for him. He had spent his whole life speaking at a volume that assumed the room would arrange itself around him. He spoke quietly now because he was speaking to one person, and the room was not the point. His hands were not entirely steady. Isabel noticed and did not remark on it. She filed it quietly into the category of things about him that were true and required no commentary. When she spoke her vows, she spoke them clearly and without rush, in the manner of a woman who has chosen something fully and has no reservations about letting that be known. Cyrus, in the third pew, permitted himself one brief expression of satisfaction before returning his face to its customary composure. They were not the easiest match London had ever seen. They were not the smoothest or the most effortlessly decorative. Not the kind of couple about whom songs are written and nothing complicated is meant. They were the kind that required, from both of them, the daily unglamorous work of honesty. He held himself to account against the man he had been, not from guilt but from vigilance, the way a man who has once been lost in a particular stretch of country learns to watch the landmarks carefully. She held him to it as well, not as punishment, but as the natural behavior of a woman who has decided the person beside her is worth the expectation. London, which had watched all of it from the altar onward, formed no single clean opinion and eventually gave up trying. They were not a fashionable story. They were something less convenient and considerably more lasting. The portrait painted of them 3 years into the marriage shows two people turned slightly toward each other rather than toward the viewer, as though mid-conversation. The painter captured something in Dominic's expression that his earlier portraits do not contain. An attentiveness, an openness, the look of a man who has learned to listen to someone he once failed to hear. Isabel's expression is the one people remark upon most. It is not soft, exactly. It is the expression of a woman who knows precisely where she is and has decided, with full information and complete clarity, that she will stay. Beneath the portrait, in handwriting no one has ever conclusively identified, is a small card that reads only, "They both held their ground." That is the whole of it. If this story moved you, if you believe that the love worth keeping is the kind built not on what we demand of each other, but on what we are willing to become, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like Isabel's waiting here. Stories of women who refused to be diminished, and of the men who finally understood why they were right to refuse. I would very much like for you to be here when the next one arrives.